This first meeting will address issues related to indigenous archaeology, territory consolidation, and human rights. This academic activity is a result of our deep solidarity and collaboration with all indigenous people and people of African descent in the Americas, and the pressing need for academic research that is more diverse and leads to concrete results and benefits for these communities. The topics were selected given the struggles that indigenous and African American peoples continually face in the Americas, so we can discuss a common agenda to protect their civil rights and recognize their land rights. We hope that these meetings will help communities grow stronger to reclaim their rights and protect their ancestral heritage and territories, but also build collaborative networks with representatives of various national organizations and universities. I would like to acknowledge the land of the Massachusetts people where UMass Boston is located and their neighboring communities of Nipmuc, Wampanoag. We also honor the lands of the Tupi, Tupiniquim, and Kaigang peoples where the University of São Paulo currently stands, and the ancestral territories of our speakers and moderators, the Tuxá peoples of Bahia, Eastern Pequot of Connecticut, Tupi-Guarani of São Paulo, and Potawatomi of Michigan. Natasha Gambrel, Yakuna Tuxá, and Luan Apuka will talk about their distinct perspectives as members of the Pequot, Tuxá, and Tupi-Guarani peoples. Each speaker is going to share thoughts and experiences that are either personal and collective as indigenous people in academic. They are talented young people who move with wisdom and eloquence between the knowledges of their traditional communities, the university, and education, showing how important it is for academia to find new paths and deeper intellectual alliances that respond to the interests of indigenous and African American communities. We are here with the purpose of continuing to expand a network of dialogue and articulation of voices and agendas of communities and peoples in the Americas, including indigenous leaders and African American movements, to talk about heritage, recovery of historical memory, ancestral practices, is protecting indigenous languages, recognizing land claims, and others. This process is only understood in the context of the relationship between traditional knowledge and other knowledge. At the same time, we try to ensure that this exchange of experience drives new versions to build an academic agenda that is in constant communication with different centers of knowledge. Finally, we would like to mention two women who inspire the activities of this event. Sylvia Kusikanki, that the decolonization of university starts when those who create knowledge, produce knowledge, and their stakeholders discuss on equal terms from different centers of thought. There is no decolonization theory without decolonization practices. And Chacriabá, the university has a challenging task. It's not enough to only recognize the existence of traditional knowledges. We have to also recognize those who bear that knowledge and share the knowledge.
For me, at least my tribe, we're actually currently fighting for to regain our federal recognition in the United States. We have to do that to prove that we're indigenous, even though we shouldn't have to do that. We know who we are. We've been here since the beginning of time. So for us, we're just trying to prove that to this day. We had our federal recognition and they took it away. So we're currently in a legal fight to prove who we are. I like to say what they did to us was genocide, because that's exactly what they did. They tried to destroy us with a single mark of a pen. So my tribe is currently in the fight for our existence. One way we kind of combat that is our archaeology program with Dr. Stephen, UMass Boston. We use our artifacts to kind of prove that we've been here since the beginning of time, and that we'll continue to fight until we get what is rightfully ours.
The Tusha people has used different strategies to defend and protect our territory, our cultural heritage, and everything that is important to us, some of the basic rights that we are entitled to. The Tusha people was really impacted in the late 80s by a dam that was built in our territory. That means that my people is still trying to get our land rights recognized by the government. This dam is a synonym to progress to those who are non-indigenous, but it really hurt the way that we live traditionally. It impacted the river. Our river is now dead and claiming for help. And the Tusha people is still trying to get our land claim recognized. If our land claims are not respected, we have to find other ways to resist. And political organization is a very important tool here. And political organization means many different things. We need education, legislators, and we need to go to school so young children can learn about us from a very early age so that we can resist. And I believe that women play a very important role in this. In my case, art is also a way for me to talk about my territory, to protect my territory. And I feel the same way about being in the university so that I can talk to my people and I can join political organizations. So these are some of the ways that we have currently protected our territory in a broader sense. For the Tupi-Guarani people, just like for other peoples, we have been fighting for centuries for the recognition of our land rights and our traditional ways of being, so that we can do what we call in our language yandereko, our way of life that we have practiced for thousands of years. And what we're doing is we are creating some materials both in our language and in Portuguese, the Brazilian language. We are also trying to teach about our traditional culture and our rituals for younger indigenous peoples. So these are very powerful strategies so that we can persist. We also use a lot of audiovisual elements to really strengthen our communications and share our sacred way of living. And we also connect to other tribes, other people, so that we can grow stronger together. So I think that with that, we can lead to more policies that address our specific needs and help us to really change our territories. I think meditation is also important because, as I said, it's really important for us to think about our knowledge. This is the decade of indigenous languages, and every year many languages were dying off because there were no speakers left. And I think that's why it's so important for us to talk to other indigenous communities so that we can resist. I see that here today we have speakers from different communities. So I think that it's great to listen to other peoples and our relatives so that we can all grow stronger together. Thank you so very much for inviting me to be here.
Some of the things that I think we're doing to kind of keep this fight alive and keep this hope alive is, like I said, just the archaeology has been a big part of that. And even with the federal recognition, when they took it away, we continue to fight, we continue to practice our culture. So I feel like that's a big part of it, meeting, coming together, and just doing our best to stay here and be visible, especially in the United States. My tribe has faced erasure, I would like to say, because a lot of times they don't allow us to speak, they don't allow us to tell our story, and we've gone forgotten. So we've made it our mission to kind of let people know that we remain, we exist, and we're still here, even if it doesn't always seem like that. bem aqui no Brasil também,
Well,
enfrentando.
yes, here in Brazil, we are facing a very similar problem. We are also being silenced and erased. In the case of the Tuxá people, we have had contact with settlers for centuries. We have also suffered aggression and abuse for centuries. My people has also been forced to abandon their language. Our territory was invaded, and we suffered a lot of discrimination so that we could cease existing and abandon our culture. But more recently, with the dam that I mentioned that was built, we saw this aggravated. I say that colonization is always a cycle that starts over and over again. Here in Brazil, when we talk about indigenous peoples, and today being such a special day for us, it's so hard for us to understand that we continue to be so invisible in the eyes of most in our country. And I think that one of the main challenges that we have faced to really defend our territory and our culture is the same we have had for so long: racism. In Brazil, racism is almost never addresses indigenous people. So with my art and of course other indigenous artists, we have tried to show how racism affects us here in Brazil and how this is something that really prevents us from really enjoying our civil rights. It's very common for us to see people become really ignorant about what the indigenous peoples go through in Brazil. And capitalism is also another layer of abuse, because they say as if we are enemies of progress, but progress for them is something that is not sustainable. There's no future the way things are done now. So my people has devised different ways to resist. So we have a community inside our territory where we organize politically, and we also have promoted our language. We have created a school curriculum that really addresses our own needs, and that helps us to perpetuate our traditional knowledge, and so that we can remain together. When I go to university, I see many people saying that scientific knowledge is better than traditional knowledge. And there are the traditional knowledges that we see in the world. But when I go back to my community, I'm reminded that everything that we know and everything that we have lived is crucial for us to really understand the world in a way that embraces diversity. And just to wrap up, I would say that our main challenges is still racism, because racism is what prevents us from enjoying civil rights and for having our land claims recognized. I think we are talking about memory here, yes? And our memory goes back centuries, and these are memories of abuse, aggression, the spiritual aggression. But something that I feel is really interesting is the fact that indigenous peoples, we have a particular view about our land. Because let's say for a long time, we did not have to claim our right to the land, because we knew that each person who, or each people who lived in an area had the right to be there, and we were there to protect the environment, to protect the forests. Because for us, the forest is not only a resource, it's not only that we can, something we can use to our own benefit, it's actually part of who we are. We are connected. So it's what we call the pluriverse. So I feel it's sometimes difficult to stay in a single patch of land, given that we can connect to the universe more broadly. But having a patch of land under our feet that is recognized, legally recognized, is something that has grown to become more important. So in my people, the Tupi-Guarani people, well, we have always been nomad, and we never really thought about land in terms of ownership, but as something that was actually enjoyed by all beings, humans, animals, spirits. And now, actually, well, this is to how we see it. Right now, we are at the last patch of forest of our particular biome. So, well, there are so many who want to take this land away from us because this is a very rich land. And we know that there are mining companies that want to take the land away from us, as they have done with different areas around us. And another thing that is under threat is our religion, let's say. And religion comes from a sense of connection. And our people was actually persecuted by the Jesuits, by the Catholic Church, that did not recognize our spirituality and tried to impose theirs on us. So our uh, knowledge was lost, our languages were lost. Tupi-Guarani was one of the most spoken languages in our territory, and now we have so few speakers. Well, the way I see it, well, I'm an Indigenous woman. I'm part of the LGBTQI plus community, and I come from northeastern Brazil, which also suffers prejudice in my country, and it all reflects in my art and how it is perceived. When I was a teenager, I started to get involved with the political activity with my people. And from a very early age, I felt how important it is for us to work collectively and to fight for the rights of your community. Go to the capital of your country and to really understand how the Brazilian government addresses indigenous issues. Here in Brazil, for the past 4 years, we had a government that overtly wanted to genocide us, to practice genocide, and to decimate indigenous peoples, LGBTQ communities, and many other minorities. Starting 2019, I have designed artistic languages to really convey what being an indigenous woman in Brazil, a lesbian Brazilian woman in Brazil is. And given the way I see the world, that is something that, of course, comes from my people, is also something I reflect on my art. I am an illustrator. I am also on social media to try to really connect to other indigenous peoples and the Brazilian people more broadly. I feel that my art has a sense of urgency, given everything that has been erased from our history and all the abuses that have been perpetrated against indigenous people and women more specifically. So what I do envisions a future that is beautiful, let's say, where more people can understand how important it is for us to embrace diversity, to embrace plural perspectives, not only indigenous knowledges, but also African Americans and other worldviews from the African diaspora. So I think we have to embrace diversity, and the tool that I use to go get there is art. I will use to be a writer as well. So I used to write a few texts that I use to create connections with other indigenous communities and Brazilian communities. And then that's when I realized how powerful art is in creating new memories and new dialogues, because the history of art is usually whitewashed, especially here in Brazil. We only had indigenous peoples painted by non-Indigenous artists. So we were spoken of, but we were never heard. And I feel that now it's about time that we can have our own voices heard, so that people can listen to our narratives, can listen to our stories, and can understand our pains and can learn from our knowledge, because we have a lot to teach. Most of what we struggle with now is the result of our culture having been destroyed. And that's something that, and we have so many threats now: capitalism, other religions that are trying to be imposed on others. And what we want to do is we want to really appreciate our own culture. If we really believe that what we have is valuable and cannot be erased, that's the first step, because our ancestors, they were the guardians of our culture, and we have inherited that role.
When I think about the future, I've always been taught that you worry about the next 7 generations, right? So my idea is everything that I do is to better the next 7 generations and put them in a better position. And I feel like some of the things that we've done to be able to do that are, lately we started this bill in Connecticut where as of next year, they're going to have to teach Indigenous studies in the classroom. And I feel like that's the first step, because I've always been taught that the elders tell the story and the children are the keepers of that story. So if we educate them young, then they understand the struggles, and we also prevent history repeating itself. So I think that's a big step that we've taken. Also, like with the archaeology, I mean, and that in itself, having those artifacts for those kids to kind of look at and feel and touch, and some of those artifacts that they touch are something that their ancestors held. So it kind of opens that up, as well as visibility, right? So with that Native American bill, we gain visibility, so we can't be erased again. And another thing I think of is about myself. I write poetry. So for me, I use poetry as a tool to tell our stories so that they can be passed down to the next generation. And I've inspired others in my tribe to pick up a pen and do the same thing, so that our stories are being told. And in the future, I envision a time where our people can rest, because for so long we've been fighting and fighting and fighting for our visibility, fighting for our identity. So my hope and my dream is that in the future, my children's children won't have to do that. My nieces and nephews won't have to do that. And that all comes from, I think, education, right? Educating the masses, letting them know that Indigenous people are here, they exist, and we remain. Through all the struggles that we've been through, we're such a proudful people, and that we're not going anywhere. That fight is inside of us. It's in our DNA. It's in our blood. It's something that we've had to do since the beginning of time. I tell people a lot of times that archaeology saved my life. When I was younger and we got our federal recognition taken away, I was left so hopeless and desolate. And I felt like I didn't have an identity anymore. The government came in and said we didn't exist. And that was a hard pill for me to swallow. But then I started doing archaeology. And when I was out there, I would find artifacts that proved those people wrong. So for me, it gave me something to hold on to, and it gave me a hope, and it gave me something physical that was there, that I could say, okay, like my people have been here. No matter what the government says, my people have been here and they continue to occupy this land, right? And they fought through everything that they fought through, and I'm holding some of these same artifacts that they held. So for me, archaeology was life-changing. And I'm so grateful, even to this day, for UMass Boston and Dr. Steve coming out there and helping us, and it fostered our community. Now we have people in our community that want to be archaeologists, that want to dig into the culture. So I just feel like for us, it was life-saving.
What I did is I sat down with my brother. I talked to elders in my community, and I created a project that says the memory of our rivers. And one thing that I talked to my brother about was precisely the idea of our memory, because in our territory, it's very common for us to find artifacts that are proof that we have been there for long. And our community is now getting together to really explore that. And it's very interesting to see how we can use technology to our own benefit now. My brother and other young people, they are now mapping things using GPS technology. So when you find an artifact, you can pin it and on a map. Where was it? What is it? But what I see in my people and the importance of archaeology to our history, we feel that some processes are slower than what we expected, especially these mappings and the number of archaeologists that can help us to create reports and help us document these artifacts. But I believe that archaeology is really a strong partner and a great asset for us. We have to understand how we interact with these artifacts. Why did our ancestors create it? Was there a spiritual sense to it? And I think we have to respect that. And I think archaeology should respect that as well. I think archaeology is now undergoing some sort of decolonization, but that's only now because education was created on the basis of this Western European mindset. And I think it's important for archaeologists to understand how we see our artifacts, how we see our language, what it all means for us. So I think we have to decolonize memory and archaeology, but I'm happy to see indigenous peoples joining these courses and professions. I think that we need to really create forums for dialogue so that we can understand what is the traditional knowledge of a particular territory and what you can and cannot do there. And I also think that there is a political layer all the time. So in the case of my people, for example, not only do we claim the land that was flooded by the dam, we also claim another sacred area that is an area filled with archaeological artifacts that have a spiritual component to them for us, but we need archaeologists, we need archaeology, but we need that to have a political goal so that they can help us really enjoy our land rights. The sacred territory is currently a place where non-indigenous people visit as tourists. Yeah, there is it's on the coast, so there are beautiful beaches there. So I think it's pressing that archaeologists go there and collect our artifacts and study them, but in a way that is not detached from our own ways of living. Many of our elders, they are actually afraid of universities and academia because from a very early age, I remember researchers from different universities going to our community to listen to our elders and to conduct their research. And then they left with rich material, but we were never told what was done with what we had shared with them. So I feel that anyone from a scientific background or from the university has to understand that we have to become partners so that science and traditional knowledge can connect, we can build bridges between the two to really help our political fights. How a university can connect to our culture. One of the advice, well, a piece of advice that I can share with you is that, well, usually when we talk about anthropology and archaeology, we think about collecting artifacts. But in the way of life for Tupi-Guarani people, our elders said, be careful with what you remove from earth. It can be a plant, it can be a pebble, it can be the feather of a bird. Everything has energy to that. And depending on what to take home, that can make you sick, spiritually sick. So I believe that the university and other repositories they really have to be careful about how they do that and how each community understands this, yeah, so that you don't collect artifacts the same way everywhere, so that you understand that you have to really understand the traditional knowledge of that culture, of that community before you do anything there. So I think this for me is decolonizing knowledge. We saw that we had some who were adults, but children were not learning our language any longer. That's why we decided to have meetings where we could reconnect to our spirituality, but also how we could register that in writing. I loved being able to hear Luan. I had never met him before, and I'm really happy to have listened to everything he had to say. I agree that we are here to redraw the limits that were imposed to us so that we can resist together. I studied Portuguese and Spanish in university, and you ask, how can researchers help us in our fights? And I think language is something very important here, right? My people speak Jubukwa, and this is not something we speak every day, and we haven't for many, many years. But our language has never been dead because it is present in our rituals. So we have now to understand how what is our way of life and how we understand the world. And this is where sometimes we find some conflict between our knowledge and university, because there is no one who speaks our language fluently, but we still have songs and dances. And to me, it's really happy to hear my young nephew use a few words. He calls me and he tells me the words he have learned in our language. What I see often in university are papers that say, oh, or actually articles saying, oh, the last person who spoke that language has just died. Oh, there are just 20 people in the world that speak that other language. And what I see is that sometimes researchers, they see us as speakers of a language, as if the language was not connected to our culture when it is. Because if our people is not here, our language is not here. So if you think about how we can get the university to help our communities, the first thing is to understand that these are people. These are people that are being abused for centuries. So when linguists talk about us as if we're only speakers of a given language, but know nothing about our struggles, help us in no way, never address our problems. This is something that for me is also very violent. And one thing that we could do in that sense to help universities work closer to us is understand that we are not an object of your research. You shouldn't just go there, collect our knowledge, go back to university, and then become a PhD in something and have a beautiful CV, and that's it. No, we're more than just the object of your research. You have to understand that we are agents of our own history.
Partner with Indigenous people and form communities, right? Like when I think about, for example, when I think about our relationship with UMass Boston, they don't come in and kind of just tell us this is what we're going to do. We're going to come to your land and we're going to dig. No, they sit and they work with us and they take what we have to say to heart and they listen to it. And I think that's the biggest thing. I even think about the way that we do archaeology on my own reservation, where whenever we remove something from the earth, we put tobacco in the ground as an offering to Mother Earth, right? And then after that, We smudge too. That's super important. When the archaeologists first come to our reservation, we smudge them. They embrace our culture. They embrace us. They look at us as more than just objects of the past, because I feel like for so long, a lot of universities look at Indigenous peoples as objects of the past and not in the present. So I honestly commend what UMass Boston does with us and what Dr. Steve does with us, because they don't treat us like these objects of the past. We're in the present. They work with us. We form partnerships. We form community. I can honestly say that I trust Dr. Steve wholeheartedly. And that's only because of that community that he's formed with us, that trust that he's built with us. So I think the first step for a lot of these universities is to build that trust so you can form that community. And in doing so, you give Indigenous people the voice they deserve. You don't speak for them.
I'd just like to amplify some of the ideas that these excellent panelists have shared with us today. The issues about recognition to states that want Indigenous peoples to be gone, and that double edge that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and the role that archaeology, archaeologists, and researchers can develop with Indigenous communities and sort of partner with them in ways that allow us to begin to undo damage in some ways. And the role of art as a form of visual sovereignty for some communities as another resistance against a state. Our responsibilities, not just to our ancestors, but to future generations, what we call future ancestors. And other beings, spirit beings, and nourishing those relationships, not just with other humans, but with more than human beings. And finally, this platform here being a form of connection between Indigenous peoples across settler colonial borders. So thank you again. My language, Kichamigwech, and Win Maganaduk, Bamapi, Minagawabmin. Thank you so much, everyone.
Real change will only come with collective action. Colonialism itself created its damage through lots of collective action, genocide, displacement, racism, ranging from the daily practices of common people all the way up through governmental action. So it must be fought and unraveled with Indigenous collective action. And in fact, many changes in, let's say, archaeology as a discipline and government policies in Brazil and the United States have changed thanks to just that kind of Indigenous activism. The three speakers show that the way forward, as it has been in the past, is through both struggle and fight and a lifting up of Indigenous voices and cultures. Now, part of that lifting up is amplifying voices, protecting bodies, valuing and encouraging artistic expression, and acknowledging history. On the other hand, the fight part is hard and tiring. As Natasha mentioned, the goal is to build time for future generations to perhaps rest a bit more as these struggles can hopefully subside as more wins are made. And language is a good example, as several people talked about. It's something that must be kept up and restored in the wake of colonialism, and that isn't easy. We've also heard about the role of artists and art, especially from Yakuna. And as many people talked about, education is vital. And as Luan noted, education is also a tool of oppression, and it needs more decolonization for it to be able to do some of the work that we all hope that it can. And I think there were lots of great comments here today on how this might work and how education can be centered in Indigenous perspectives rather than just overriding or trying superficially to bring them in. Now, one of my favorite moments in the panel was when Luan talked about memory. Luan noted that memory is the future and it helps to build the future, and also that the future is yesterday and it is embodied. And I like the way this brought all of these multiple temporalities and experiences and embodiments kind of all together in a particularly Indigenous way. And Luan also noted some important things, powerful things about territory, that means land It means body and it means language. And to me, this expanded thinking addresses the fundamental questions of sovereignty. And on the topic of memory, I just want to briefly mention archaeology as it surfaced as a theme in the panel and in the questions. And as noted in the beginning, I am an archaeologist, and I've had the honor of working with the Eastern Pequot Tribal Nation for the last 20 years on an archaeology and heritage project. Natasha or Nikki referred to that several times during some of her comments. And this project has taught me so much about Indigenous rights, land, history, community, identity, and knowledge. And it's also been a space for us to develop a deep collaboration between Native Nation and university, and between archaeologists and a lived community. And it has shown me that even when I had doubts about my own discipline, one that it has terrible colonial roots and practices, as we all know about archaeology, that it can actually do some good. And to do that good, it has to be aligned with Indigenous community needs. And Natasha today called it life-saving. And honestly, I can think of nothing more profound and humbling than hearing that about archaeology, because that doesn't happen very often. And archaeology can do this, and this is acknowledging the question that Iris raised, by not just doing science, but by making archaeology about telling stories of persistence, and as some Indigenous people in North America say, stories of survivance. Focusing on storytelling aligns the archaeology project with some of the fundamental ways of Indigenous sharing and education, that is, through stories. And as Yakuna and Luan both noted in different ways, archaeology and education and other parts of the academy must be political. It must be decolonized. It must give rather than take, and it must acknowledge the well-founded fears and suspicions of academia that some Indigenous communities have. And responding to Luan's comment about the university as a repository, I think that universities should definitely be moving away from that role and instead focus on uplifting, caretaking, allegiance, and respect.